Hi everyone, I'm Dina with Mills Family Gardening. In this video, I would like to talk about drip irrigation. Back in August, we went on a vacation which lasted 12 days, and we put our whole garden, which is our whole backyard, on drip irrigation. We didn't ask anybody to water our garden. I put a timer, and our drip irrigation did a really good job keeping everything watered, and when we came back, everything actually survived, and it looked like okra was producing really well. Our pumpkins and squash are growing really well. So I'm really happy with our drip irrigation, and I would like to share with you how we installed it and why you should have drip irrigation in your garden too. If you live in a colder climate, more up north, it's okay not to have a drip irrigation for a large garden because the weather is cooler, it rains occasionally, and the plants do great. But where we live in North Texas, Zone 8A, our summers get so hot and dry that even if we mulch our in-ground beds and water, it's still not enough, and it would take me hours and hours to water our garden every day. For that reason, we need to have some kind of irrigation system to keep our gardens watered. Otherwise, in our summer heat, everything will die. Well, maybe except for okra. So here's how we set up our drip irrigation. We have this faucet in our backyard, and then to the faucet we connected this backflow preventer. Then after that we have this connector that splits the water. So on one side of it we can have our garden hose, and on the other side we have the drip irrigation. Then we have a timer. Then to the timer we connected a pressure regulator, and then we have our fertilizer injector, which is this white pipe. And then to it, we connected the main poly tubing, which is 1/2 inch in diameter. We keep the faucet on all the time because the more we turn it, the more it damages and starts leaking. And what turns the water on and off is this Y connector. You see the black valves that you can turn depending on if you want the water on or off. For example, the hose right now is off, but when we need to use it, we simply turn this valve towards the faucet, and then you can hear and you can see that the hose is expanding, so the water is flowing to the hose. Then we can simply turn it off like that. Now the valve that's connected to the drip irrigation is constantly on, and the timer keeps the water off. And when the time comes, then the water turns on and the garden is watered. Before I installed the timer, I was worried that it would be leaking a lot, and you can see that right now it's dripping a little bit, and it's not too bad. For that reason, I put the bucket underneath so the water is stored in the bucket, and when we went on a trip, I actually put a plant underneath it, so all the water was dripping into the plant and keeping that plant alive. In our garden beds, we use smaller 1/4 inch size drip lines that we connect to the main 1/2 inch poly tubing. And the smaller drip lines already have pre-installed emitters or holes that let the water out. And they're spaced at 6 inches. That's what we like, that's what we prefer, and that's what works in our garden. But they also have 12-inch or 18-inch spaced emitters depending on what your needs are. Before we install these smaller drip lines, and they are spaced at 6 inches, like I said, I was worried that when I plant radishes at about 2 or 3 inches apart, the radishes in between the drip emitters would not be watered as well. But as it turns out, if you water for an hour or a couple of hours, then eventually this whole area, even in between the drip emitters, gets watered and gets moist also. So even the radishes that are planted in between the drip emitters, they get watered and they get plenty of moisture. And there are 2 ways to irrigate your garden. The first one is drip irrigation, what we use, and the second one is soaker hose. Last year, early spring, I tried to use both, and I discovered that I like drip irrigation much better, especially after using it for 2 years or almost 2 years. The problem with soaker hoses is it takes them a long time to get filled up with water, and for that water to start seeping out of the hoses. By the time soaker hoses start actually watering an in-ground bed, drip lines are halfway done watering, and the bed that has drip lines gets moist and watered much faster than the bed with soaker hoses. Also, after reading some reviews, use, it turns out that once that soaker hose is broken, you have to replace the whole length of that soaker hose. But with drip lines, if one of the emitters does not work properly, you can simply cut out the small part and then install a small part back in your bed. I mentioned earlier that we have a fertilizer injector connected to our drip irrigation, and it's such a game changer for us. That way I don't have to run around with a hose or with a watering can fertilizing every single plant with a liquid fish fertilizer, and that's what we use in our garden. Liquid fertilizer works really well for fertilizer injector, and fertilizer injector is what contains that liquid fertilizer inside, and through the lines it feeds the whole garden with that fertilizer. So you can just turn on your faucet or the valve, and the fertilizer injector and drip irrigation does all the work for you. So if you're considering to get a drip irrigation system, I highly recommend that you get a fertilizer injector, and that will cut back your watering and fertilizing time by a lot. We leave our drip irrigation in place during winter time, and here in Texas we do get really cold temperatures, sometimes 10 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes one winter we had 0 degrees Fahrenheit, and we still kept it out and it worked just fine. I did have to replace drip lines in a few places, but overall it stayed intact and worked just fine. I do bring inside some plastic pieces like the timer, pressure regulator, and backflow preventer. During the summertime, this spot right here where we have the fertilizer injector gets a full afternoon Texas sun, and you know it might be in triple digits. And the fertilizer injector has been here for 2 years. It never broke. It's working just fine. So it's really heavy duty. It's really solid and stable. So I highly recommend you use it. And our particular brand is an Easy Flow. Before we got the timer for our drip irrigation, I would often forget to turn on the drip irrigation, so the garden would stay dry in our triple-digit weather. Or after I turn it on, I would forget to turn it off, and then 5 hours later I realized that, oh my goodness, I forgot to turn off the water and our garden is flooded and the whole backyard is pretty much flooded. Installing the timer has made a big difference in our drip irrigation. I never waste water. In other words, the drip irrigation doesn't run for 5 hours. If I set it for 2 hours, it waters for 2 hours and shuts down. And it never forgets to start watering the garden. If I set it for every day, then it turns on at the same time every day. If I set it for every other day, it turns on the water at the same time every other day, and then it runs for an hour or 2 hours depending on what you want to set your irrigation for. So I highly recommend that you install a drip irrigation system with a timer and fertilizer injector. And also choosing between a drip irrigation system and soaker hoses, I would go with drip irrigation. It's so much easier, it's so much faster and easier to fix, and they also can mark your spacing. If you need to plant plants at 6 inches, you can simply go by drip emitters and plant them at 6 inches. If you install 50 feet of drip line continuously throughout your garden, then there's not going to be enough water pressure to water the other end of the drip line. In other words, you might have really good watering for the first 20 feet, but then the last 20 feet, you're not going to have any water there. All your plants are not going to be watered. So I've discovered it's much more efficient to cut those 1/4 inch drip lines into 10 or 15 foot long pieces. And that's all about drip irrigation. I'm so glad we installed it. It's helping us a lot. It's saving us a lot of time. Sometimes I even forget that I have to go outside and water the garden at all. So if you're thinking of installing a drip irrigation, go for it. That's all for today. Thank you so much for watching this video, and have a great day.